I want you to know at that point, I am so weak I cannot sit up like I am right now. I was in a zero gravity chair with my knees higher than my nose. I could take a couple of steps with my 2 walking sticks. I had trigeminal neuralgia, very, severe, intense electrical pain from my temple down to my jaw. We are so lonely. We have our phones and we have a lot of social media contact that reinforces that we're unworthy and we're lonely, we're inadequate. That sense of isolation is so inflammatory. It's more inflammatory than smoking. If my house has smoke billowing out of the windows, but my kids are in there, I'm going to run over broken glass barefoot to save my kids. So if there's purpose, we'll do hard things. We'll do painful things. We know that the further north you go, the more likely you are in modern society to have a low vitamin D. And we know that people with low vitamin Ds are more likely to have more aggressive disease states. We thought if you just took a vitamin D supplement, that would fix things. But you probably really need to go outside and get a tan. When I was 9, my sister died. And that was very traumatic for my family. My family never fully recovered from that. When I added up my at-risk childhood experience score, I was like, oh my God, it was way higher.
This is Decentralized Radio. I'm Tristan.
And I'm Ryan.
The goal of this podcast is to help educate you on how to live your most optimal life. We will host industry expert guests to shed light on topics that matter.
We are not gurus, rather 2 individuals who have had to pave their own path to health and vitality, independent of the centralized systems that plague modern society. Dr. Terry Wahls, welcome to Decentralized Radio. How are you this fine Friday morning before Christmas?
Oh, excellent. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all the wonderful work that you're doing.
No, I appreciate it. It's a funny story. I discovered you in 2019, late 2019, when I was first going through some of my own autoimmune neurological issues. And I found your book, actually thinking at the time that I had potentially MS. I had not had any MRIs or anything yet, but it was a super strange symptoms. And as you know, a lot of these things overlap amongst various diseases. So I was just trying to rule things out. And I found your book and it introduced me to the concept of mitochondrial health. And I have an interview that I did with you in 2020 that I'll link in the description below that goes over a lot of your story overcoming, relapsing remitting MS and then secondary progressive. Your story is just incredible. And I really implore people to read your book, which came out, I believe, in 2014. And then you have I think the book before that was Minding My Mitochondria.
Yeah.
And those are really profound statements because it sort of shakes the groundwork of what in a centralized medical paradigm is focused on the RNA and DNA genome. And you were like, hey, let's look at this mitochondrial DNA stuff.
Yeah, if we go back to the evolutionary history that we all share, about 4 billion years ago was the first inkling that biochemical processes were happening. That's the beginning of life. And then, we continue to evolve. And about 2 billion years ago, we have mitochondria. And these ancient mitochondria are really bacteria that were engulfed by larger bacteria. And these early mitochondria could use oxygen more effectively to create ATP or the adenosine triphosphate, which all the listeners, I want you to know, that's the currency of life. That's what most of our cells are using to nudge the biochemistry that we need to have happen to sustain life. And so if your mitochondria are working well, your cells can do all of the work assigned to it. But if your mitochondria begin to get sluggish and they can't produce ATP as well, then that cell can't do the work assigned to it nearly as well. And for most of us, the cells that have to do the most work are the cells in the brain, the cells in the retina, because that's basically a camcorder, a video recorder, and the cells in the heart. And so when people have neurologic or psychiatric symptoms, I'm thinking mitochondria not working very well. If they're having difficulty with their vision, I'm thinking the mitochondria not working well. And if they're having heart-related issues, I'm focused on mitochondria. And that's the people that I see have neurologic and psychiatric symptoms. They often have visual symptoms. Sometimes they'll have cardiac symptoms. And I focus on helping them understand that we have to take care of the mitochondria. And of course, no physician has talked to them about cellular health or about mitochondrial health.
And I think it's such a profound thing, because I remember when I read your book the first time, which was sort of just like really cracking the door open to all of this stuff and the nuances and complexities, I was thinking about just how many modern day, like the top modern day illnesses that affect people. We think about Alzheimer's, we think about Parkinson's, we think about heart disease. And if you think about mitochondria, we have most of our mitochondria buried in here and in here. And it's incredible, because when you learn about the principal fundamentals around what create healthy mitochondria, you really have the power given back to you as to what you can do about it to certain degrees. But it is super empowering. And that's what I think is great about the mission you've been on, is really patient empowerment, you know?
Right. I want people to know that there is so much that we can do to create a healthier, supportive environment for our mitochondria. And there's so much that we're doing that are poisoning our mitochondria, making it harder for our cells to function well. And unfortunately, most primary care physicians, most neurologists, most subspecialists aren't thinking this way. They're simply thinking, because they don't have much time. They've got 7 minutes on average to see you, to make a quick diagnosis, and to tell you what the FDA-approved drugs are. They aren't really don't have the time to understand your diet and lifestyle, and how your diet and lifestyle is either sabotaging or supporting your health goals.
And it's interesting. We recently talked to Dr. Sean Baker just about algorithmic medicine, and how a lot of physicians use algorithmic medicine to create protocols or prescribe prescriptions and stuff like that. And in some ways, I think it's created sort of a bottleneck, like for both the doctors and the patients. And I think in some ways, because of the way things have been set up, it does lead to a lack of sufficient care. And I don't really want to blame anybody, because like you said, it's how they were taught and how you have been taught originally in the centralized system. So it's just how it's been set up, and it's about changing that, which is a huge feat,
And part of this is that, and we all are guilty of this, we'd like to have the quick fix. And it's hard for us to change our habits. It's hard for us to change our understanding of the world. And anyone who's listening here, I want you to acknowledge that you have a current understanding of the world. And it takes a lot of evidence for you to shift your understanding. And it took a lot of evidence for me to shift my understanding of how to treat MS, how to treat complex chronic disease. But fortunately, God gave me a very devastating illness and lots of evidence that things were not working. And finally, I started on my path of, I can still read, I can still learn. And so I very slowly, methodically started reading and studying for other progressive neurologic diseases, the animal models. And that's where I developed the theory that it was the mitochondria and dysfunction of the mitochondria that drove disability in progressive multiple sclerosis, in Parkinson's, in Alzheimer's, in ALS, in Huntington's. And then I would eventually realize that's what's driving disability for people with many vision-related problems, many heart-related problems, and many systemic autoimmune diseases that also have neurologic and psychiatric problems. And so over time, I would focus more and more on cellular health, more and more on mitochondrial health. And, Ryan, at first, the first 4 years that I was having this revitalization of my understanding, I was focused on supplements. And the supplements were super helpful. I'd create the supplement cocktail for mitochondria. It slowed my disability progression. And man, I was so grateful. And I could tell if I took my mitochondrial supplements, my fatigue was a little less severe. and I felt way worse if I didn't take my supplements. So I'm super grateful. I discovered a study in electrical stimulation of muscles, and I add that to my rehab. That's very helpful. But then I had this really amazing aha, Ryan, and I laughed that it took me this long to have it. I'd been doing the paleo diet for 5 years, and I'd still, I was going downhill, but, a little more slowly. I was doing my supplements, still going downhill, but a bit more slowly. And then I had this aha, like, what if I redesigned my paleo diet that I'd been doing already for 5 years based on this, what I'd learned about the mitochondria, this long list of supplements I was using. What if I redesigned my paleo diet based on those supplements? So that was, several more months of research. And I had this new way of eating in 2007. Now, for all of your listeners, I want you to know at that point, I am so weak I cannot sit up like I am right now. I was in a zero gravity chair with my knees higher than my nose. I could take a couple of steps with my 2 walking sticks. I had trigeminal neuralgia, very, severe, intense electrical pain from my temple down to my jaw. I'm beginning to have brain fog. It's very clear to me, because I've had 27 years of worsening trigeminal neuralgia, 7 years of progressively worsening MS, that I'm on track to become bedridden by my illness, demented by my illness, and probably dying with intractable pain due to trigeminal neuralgia. I mean, a really very grim future. In December 26, 2007, I start this new way, very structured paleo diet. A month later, my physical therapist says, Terry, you're getting stronger, and he advances my exercises, and I can now exercise 10 minutes twice a day. My pain is less, my fatigue is less. And I tell Jackie, I want to try sitting up at the table in a regular chair. First time in years. And that goes well. And then a couple months later, I'm walking with 2 walking sticks in the hallways at the hospital, and then with 1, and then with none. And, I continue to improve. And then in the spring, I bike around the block for the first time. And after that, I bike a little bit more every day. And in October, Jackie signs me up for the Courage Ride, which is 18.5 miles. And, when I successfully do that and I cross that finish line, my kids are crying, Jackie's crying, I'm crying. And that fundamentally changes how I think about disease and health, because that's when I realize, well, I am getting better. How much recovery might be possible? And it becomes my mission to teach the world that there's a lot you can do.
Hey, friend. Thanks for listening. If you really enjoy this podcast, it would be really appreciated if you left us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, or subscribe to our content on YouTube. This helps us get to a larger reach and a larger audience to spread this wonderful free education.
There's a whole lot we can do.
It's truly incredible. And I kind of want to unpack that a little bit. First, I'd like to sort of ask, just because when you wrote the Wahls protocol, I think the first edition was 2014, correct?
Yeah, correct.
How has that, or what has changed, I suppose? And I know you had a revitalized edition a couple of years ago too that I also read.
So,
but what has changed?
We revised and updated it, and it came out just immediately before the pandemic. So that was sort of too bad. Didn't get as much publicity. Some of the things that we are aware, there's a lot more research supporting that electrical stimulation of muscles can be super helpful for people who have severe disability and are having difficulty exercising, because it reduces the harm of physical activity. It also, if you do electrical stimulation while you are working out, you get a lot more nerve growth factor produced in the brain, which is fabulous for repairing your brain, for making more synapses. That is just really, really good for you. And then I've further refined my dietary recommendations. I clarified we have an elimination diet variation. We talked about FODMAPs, we talked about oxalates, and we further refined my recommendations on ketogenic eating. And I do think ketogenic eating can be really very helpful for people with severe mental health issues, with cognitive decline, and where we're now doing a research that I'm very excited about, comparing the paleo diet and the ketogenic diet to usual diet for people with MS. And I really don't know which of those two diets will be better. There's a lot to say the keto will be better, and a lot to say the paleo will be better. So it's going to be a fun test.
Yeah, it's going to be really exciting. You have a lot of fun stuff coming up. And I sort of want to dive into this a little bit because I, too, have had some revelations even since we last spoke and worked together in 2020, which was a very strange year. It was actually a good time to do some of this stuff because a lot of people, like, minus the frightening things, were kind of forced to take a step back and look at themselves in the mirror and be like, and what I do makes me happy. Like, is my health good? Like, should I be focusing on this more? And I remember during that time, because I was just kind of squatting at home because I really couldn't do much. It was really great. It gave me like 6-8 months of just like hardcore working on myself.
So it was a great time to have, because we were all forced to really reflect on, what am I doing? Is this the most important stuff?
Yeah, 100%. So one thing I wanted to dive into, and this may be some concepts that I'm sure you're aware of, but maybe hasn't either been asked you too often or not. So hopefully it's sort of a new discussion. But I've been doing a lot of reading around various things around Dr. Pollack's work on water and exclusion zone water, how NEMFs affect cellular biology on like an electrical level, and also with things like cytochrome C oxidase in the mitochondria, the fact that it is actually sensitive to light. And why I think that's important is that, like you were saying earlier, like all energy made in the human body comes from our mitochondrial nano engines. And I'm going to trip over my words a little bit because I've been trying to work on the terminology. I know it fundamentally in my head, but it's like spitting it out is like, it's still a skill I'm attaining. But fundamentally what these are doing is that they take electrons from our food. And I've wondered if we think about life on this planet, like plants use photosynthesis to create energy, basically. And have you ever thought of the idea of us taking food and like our mitochondria basically reverse engineering photosynthesis to create energy?
Well, that is what happens. The plants use light through photosynthesis to drive the chemistry of life for them to build all of their structures, their cell walls, their vascular system, their proteins. So again, they use photosynthesis in a very similar way that our mitochondria use electron transport chain to create ATP that we can use to drive the chemistry of life. And what I think is, to me, quite fascinating, we have so many similar biochemical pathways, plants, bacteria, fungi, animals, which is why the basic scientists can learn so much about physiology using yeast, bacteria, flies, worms, rodents, other mammals, including primates. It's not a complete one-to-one analogy with humans, but remarkably similar. We have remarkably similar biochemical pathways that have been shared across many species that let us understand how life works and gives us clues as to what we could do to be improving ourselves. Now, and I think that's really very helpful. I also look at this through an ancestral health lens, through evolutionary biology, to say, okay, what have we done globally through our ancestral societies in diverse parts of the world that were led to reproductive success? What were the diet and lifestyle and habits that we had that were helpful? And can we replicate or adapt our current living circumstances to mimic some of those those diet, lifestyle, and habits that our ancestors had? And then obviously we're going to do a fair amount of adaptation because we're going to continue to use our cell phones. We're going to continue to work. We're going to continue to interact with our computers. We're still going to have to eat and exercise and do all that. But are there lessons that we could take from a close look at what our ancestors were doing? And I think there are.
No, I totally agree. I think that's the completely right way to view it. And it's once you sort of understand, I think that principle of understanding that we are connected to nature, it's not a separate entity. Like we're pretty much the only species that's really taken nature to an extent out of the equation, because we have a very powerful thing between our ears that allows us to philosophize all this stuff. And think about grandeur and things like that. And it's super great, but it is important that I think, and you do a great job of this and you showcase it, like simple things like gardening, like going outside, like
it does not have to be hard.
No, and that's the beautiful part, honestly, is that the more you know, like knowledge is power, right? So it can be your enemy too, but the more you know, the better you can do. And I think truthfully, it goes back to really just showing that to people, because ancestral principles and like nature's laws aren't really too difficult to understand. And once you kind of see it and remove, I think the most difficult part is removing the noise. And for me, one question I wanted to ask you is like, a lot of things changed for us during the late 1800s up to now through the Industrial Revolution, advent of modern lighting. We basically eliminated a bunch of our circadian mechanism by allowing ourselves to have artificial blue lit nights and disrupting circadian rhythms. What have been in your eyes like the largest disruptors to our mitochondrial health over maybe the last 150 years? What would you say? Obviously, like we could talk about big food and all that stuff, but there's so much.
Are you self-employed or a small business owner and are tired of paying hundreds of dollars a month to centralized health insurance companies for minimal coverage because there is no alternative? Well, I have good news for you. There is. And this podcast is brought to you by Crowd Health. Crowd Health is a more decentralized alternative to health insurance, and it uses community and crowdfunding to help its members pay for emergencies when they do happen. They incentivize and prioritize health and personal responsibility and share the thought that you should really only be using the centralized healthcare system when emergencies do happen. This is what I am on board with, and I have personally signed up for Crowd Health since I left the corporate engineering world and the medical benefits that come with it. If you want to learn more, you can check out our episode with CEO and founder Andy Schoonover, or you can head over to joincrowdhealth.com and use code DRADIO, DRADIO, when you sign up to get a discounted rate of only $99 for the first 3 months. Centralized healthcare is one of the biggest issues in our society today, and I really love what Crowd Health is doing to provide an alternative for people who care.
So when we outsourced cooking and we started eating more and more packaged foods that have, about 80,000 different food additives added to them that can confuse our biologic signaling. So that's a big problem. When we started having more and more exposures to pesticides and heavy metals, that's poisoning our mitochondria. When our nutrient intake plummeted, and so our mineral intake plummeted. And so when we don't have enough zinc, enough magnesium, in particular, I'd say zinc and magnesium are probably the two most common, but you have other trace minerals. Our bodies have to substitute something. So they substitute lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, and that further accelerates the poisoning. When we don't have, we're not going to bed at night and we're sleeping in. So we don't have our day-night cycle in sync with the earth. That creates more problem. We're lonely. We are so lonely. We have our phones and we have a lot of social media contact that reinforces that we're unworthy and we're lonely, we're inadequate. In that sense of isolation is so inflammatory. It's more inflammatory than smoking. It's more inflammatory than being sedentary. It would appear to be one of the most inflammatory drivers of all. And so the pandemic accelerated that for our elderly. It accelerated that for our young people. It accelerated that for the rest of the adults as well. We are lonely. We aren't connected to our spiritual, religious homes anymore. And that, for many people, erodes the sense of purpose. And we can do hard things, really hard things, when there's a purpose behind it. And,
No, I was just going to. Yeah, exactly. That's so big. No, I'll let you keep going because this is great.
If there's no purpose, I just want to have comfort. I just want to have pleasure. If I have purpose, if my house has smoke billowing out of the windows, but my kids are in there, I'm going to run over broken glass barefoot to save my kids. If my dog is in there, I'm probably still going to run over broken glass. Maybe not quite as fast, but I want to save my dog as well. So if there's purpose, we'll do hard things. We'll do painful things. But if there's no purpose, I just want comfort. I want comfort and pleasure. And that's where many of our people are living at. There's no purpose, so they want only comfort and pleasure. And that sets them up for risk for progressive neurologic and psychiatric disorders.
And that's super big because I think about it. My mom is a first grade school teacher, and she's retiring this year. She's very excited. I'm getting her into all the weird health principles. She read your book years and years ago when I read it. But she's been getting into a bunch of stuff. She'll send me pictures of her grounding. And I think it's so funny. But great. But I've had a lot of discussions with her about her teaching experience over her 30, 35 years. And she's really expressed to me the level of psychiatric illness she sees in very young children. So we're talking 6 years old compared to when she first began teaching. She's never seen these levels of anxiety in children. And of course, over the last 3 years specifically, it's only exacerbated the issues. And actually during 2020, because a lot of young kids were home and they weren't in primary school or they weren't in kindergarten, first grade in person, they didn't develop a lot of social skills. And so she's seeing a lot of underdeveloped social skills within young children. And so it's going to be interesting to see this generation grow up. But also I think while technology has been such a benefit, and I don't ever want to say we should throw it aside and go live in the woods, which would be fun for a week or two or a month. But it's about how we view it as a tool and how it's used. And like you were saying with social media and stuff over the last couple of years, we are innately communal animals, so it's very important to have that sense of community and purpose. And I think, like you said, that is such an under-discussed issue within physical health manifestation and mental health stuff.
My daughter did a lovely backpacking trip in Northeast Iowa, a lovely 3-day weekend. She has an Oura ring, came back and made some really interesting observations that her heart rate variability was dramatically higher. Her stress level was dramatically lower. Her sleep was dramatically better during that 3-day weekend. And her observation was, and her anxiety was dramatically better. So her observation was, I think that was phenomenally good for my mental health and my physical health. And I should probably do this on a regular basis. And yes, the more time that we spend outside in our gardens, in the forest or in the meadows, taking hikes and camping, the better our cells will function, the better our bodies will function, and the better our mental health will be. And I'd say physical health will be.
That was one of the revelations I had. My grandparents have a cabin up in northern Michigan, and it's it's not like per se isolated, but you're in the middle of the woods. There's no Wi-Fi. So you don't really have internet unless you use your LTE on your phone. They have a TV that has like 3 channels and then like a VCR and like a DVD player. And you're pretty much forced to just sort of embrace being in the moment. And I think that's also a very valuable skill, like practicing mindfulness and being in the moment is something I've greatly struggled with over the last, forever, now that I think about it. But it's such a valuable thing to take that time. And I think, if anything, I have become so, for anyone that's gone through struggles like you have, Dr. Wahls, or I have, or anybody listening, I feel like you really end up at a fork in the road where you have an opportunity to perhaps in some ways become the best version of yourself or let your situation destroy you. And I've seen both happen. But it's amazing how through this, for me personally, I have been able to find a sense of purpose with my life. And I think that it's valuable for anyone listening to, take a step back for a minute and really just like when you have time, evaluate, like, what are my personal goals? What are my values? What do I stand for? What do I want to achieve with my life? And it doesn't need to be some grandiose thing of like owning a Fortune 500 company or something, but I think it's important for everyone to have purpose. And I see it within my own folks generation. I look at sort of late boomer generation, Gen X, kind of growing up in that sort of zone of, go to school, you go to college, you get a job that pays well, and you raise a family, and then you retire, and then, that's kind of the life cycle.
I think it's, anyone who's listening, let's say you have a chronic disease and you've not recovered, you're still suffering from your autoimmune issue that's causing you neurologic or psychiatric symptoms. I want to encourage you, and I challenge you to think about how you can give back to your tribe, even though you haven't recovered yet. There are things that you could be doing to support your community. And I invite you to think about that, to reach out to your support groups for that community and start giving back. Because it will help give you purpose. It will help you be connected. It will decrease the loneliness. And that is some of the most profound self-care that you can do.
I think that's really powerful. And because I feel like in those moments when you are at a really desperate stage or you're just like feeling really down because you're kind of in the middle of it and you don't have that clarity yet, you sort of feel like you're just a lump in space. And that can really further drag you down the hole. And so I do find that to be very valuable. How have you dealt with, and I know you've dealt with this with working with clients individually as well, is how do you help people get out of the hole of identifying almost their entire being with their diagnosis? Because I know that was a struggle for me for a long time, and I see it every day.
Oh, yeah. Well, one of my the questions I love asking is what I talked about earlier, is if your home was beginning to be on fire, smoke running out of the windows, who or what do you care so deeply about that you'd rush in to go save? Yeah, and nearly always it's, my kids, my grandkids, my dog, or my cat. Those are the most common answers. Occasionally it's a piece of work that they're on. And then we can begin to ask, okay, so what can we do to improve your self-care so that you could be there more effectively for your children, grandchildren, your dog, or your cat? And that helps them with their self-care. And then we have the conversation about who are you connected to outside of your family? And then, if it's their church, great. I want to get them going back to church. If they don't have a church, then I'm like, okay, let's get you volunteering for an organization that could speak to your heart. And it might be the Humane Society. It might be the local pet shelter. It might be a patient advocacy group for that supports people with your illness. I don't care what the group is, but I want them volunteering somewhere. And then we sort of work out what little easy volunteer action they can begin doing. because that will help them get connected. And if they can't do either one of those, then I encourage them to get started with a mental health counselor, because if we can't get them looking outside themselves, it's going to be a huge struggle to have that person be successful with improving their diet and self-care.
Actually, it's really interesting to say that, because I think it's really important, and it's great because I think it is an under-discussed part of all the stuff. And there was a great book that I'm sure you know very well. I tell everyone I ever meet to read it. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of stuff that, goes on in here maybe 10 years ago, or it affected you, that is now manifesting in some form of ailment that you have as well. And it's super important to address that. And that's actually something I personally have been working on with my therapist, doing EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization, basically. But it's super helpful to just like process those emotions, because you really don't know. Like, sometimes I found that actually the very first thing that I did when I started developing really bad neuropathic pain, basically pretty much all over, was my dad got me this book that we actually got for him, but he gave it to me to read. And it was called Calm the F Down. And I read it. And when I did, I realized, like, I've had really bad worry, anxiety for 10 years before any of this stuff happened. And when I realized that, like, not everything I worry about happens, I think almost 30% of my pain was gone just reading that book, just because I was able to lower that stress state. And it's really incredible what can happen just through that mind work.
In our clinical trials, in one of the studies that we did, I did intakes for every one of the patients, basically a functional medicine intake. And I saw that every one of the patients had severe early life stress, which got me like, wow, this is pretty interesting. So then I went back and looked at the literature and saw just how much more probable early life stress, that is adverse childhood experiences, are in people with multiple sclerosis or serious systemic autoimmune disease with neurologic issues. And the other thing that it did, Ryan, was it got me reflecting on my early life stress, which I had not done before. When I was 9, my sister died. And that was very traumatic for my family. My parents had, intense grief. And my family never fully recovered from that. So when I added up my adverse childhood experience score, I was like, oh my God, it was way higher. And, for most of us, we can look back, once you get into the functional medicine space, you're beginning to think a little differently. You can see that there are many contributing factors. And so, for me, there were lots of, early antibiotics, private well in farm country, a lot of pesticide exposures, a lot of heavy metal exposures because of my art background, toxin exposures during medical school. But one I had not appreciated until I'd done that research was my early life stress that had been profound, probably for 12 years.
It's really crazy. It's really incredible. And one thing I sort of wanted to ask too, just because you sort of mentioned it, this sort of turned in a corner here, but like a lot of people that end up, finding you, finding me, all these things, sort of, they go on a conventional path for a while, then they sort of hit a dead end. Like I went to Boston, Mass, met with like the best people you can meet with. Nothing bad to say about them. It was an interesting experience, but it sort of led me to the common theme of a pill for an ill sort of description of medicine. And then, so that's when I turned to sort of functional medicine. I met you. I met Dr. Charlin, who you work pretty closely with, and just did a really good Parkinson's and basically a series, which was really, really cool.
Yeah.
And really, really profound. But I found a very similar issue within functional medicine, where instead of it's a pill for an ill, it's still a pill for an ill, but in a form of a supplement. And while I think supplements can be valuable, where is the length? Because I mean, no one's perfect. I'm not trying to throw anybody or any ideology under the bus for sure. And I learned a lot, but I found the same frustrations within myself that I was now in functional medicine. And I've had a lot of people come to me with this where now they're taking all these supplements, but things haven't changed. And so that's when it occurred to me, for me, the biggest needle movers have been really taking serious, moving back to nature's principles, like waking up with the sun, seeing the sunrise, all these things, and really moving outside the paradigm of all the fancy lab testing, all the stool sampling, which aren't not valuable. And I believe there are certain scenarios, but I think that people get lost in there. And I love just your thoughts, because you've been on both sides.
This podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, EMR Tech. EMR Tech manufactures high-quality, high-powered red light therapy devices. In my opinion, red and infrared light are two of the biggest nutrient deficiencies in our modern society due to our indoor lifestyles. Red light therapy devices like the ones from EMR Tech can help combat that by providing high-powered red light while being indoors. I personally use mine every morning and every evening. Red and near infrared light is extremely beneficial for energy production in our body because it boosts mitochondrial function and penetrates deep into the cell. It is also extremely beneficial for skin health, eye health, as well as our circadian rhythms. And this is actually pretty much why I bought everyone in my family an EMR Tech red light therapy device for Christmas. EMR Tech panels are low flicker, low EMF, and use targeted wavelengths such as 830 and 630 nanometers, amongst others, to get extremely effective results. For more information, go to emrtech.com and use our code DRadio10 for 10% off your order. That's emrtek.com with our code DRadio, DRADIO 10 to save at checkout.
One of the wonderful things that happened to me in my functional medicine journey was that as I got into functional medicine, my clinical practice was in the Iowa City Veterans Affairs Hospital. And so I couldn't do any of the fancy functional medicine testing, and I couldn't use any of the fancy functional medicine supplements. I could do basic primary care labs like a CBC, a lipid panel, a vitamin D, a folate B12, homocysteine, a hemoglobin A1C. And that was my lab toolkit. And the people I saw were people who were disabled, who were no longer working, who were living on food stamps, who lived in rural Iowa or rural Missouri or rural Illinois, shopping at small town rural grocery stores or the small town convenience stores. And I still had remarkable results because all that I could get people to do is, were you willing to work with me to really change your diet and lifestyle? And if you were, you could work with me. If you couldn't do that, I'd fire you and send you back to your primary care doctor. So like, come back when you're ready, because this is all we're going to work on. And we had remarkable success, which led to word of mouth demand, which forced me to continually reimagine my clinic because I wanted people to get in. So we went from small group to large group, to small classes to large classes, to very large classes, to my deciding I needed to teach the public. And I then hired someone to take over my lifestyle clinic. And what I learned by having those constraints, which at the time, Brian, really pissed me off, because I wanted to be able to do the advanced testing. I wanted to be able to use those advanced supplements. But because I couldn't, and because I was like, no, I felt called to practice this way, the way that I could, which was diet and lifestyle. What I managed to see is I could have remarkable success without the advanced testing, without the advanced supplements. I couldn't fix everyone. And absolutely it's true that I could have made much further progress if I got to see them in my private practice, where I could do the advanced testing and the advanced supplements. However, the other thing that I saw in my private practice is that sometimes people would come, do the advanced testing, take the advanced supplements, and not change their diet or lifestyle. Mm-hmm. Because they weren't yet ready to do that.
Yeah. And that's the nuance of being the practitioner, is being able to meet your client where they are at and helping them along their unique journey, which it's such a beautiful thing when things work right. But it's true. I saw someone made a very interesting comment to me about how like, man, just like changing your lifestyle is like so difficult and most people can't do it. That's why it was sort of like a bad pitch. They were trying to pitch me like a partnership with some supplement thing. But my thought when I read that was like, I get it. It isn't easy.
It is hard.
It is hard, but you have to. You have to. You can't say the same.
If we look at people who start an exercise program, within a year, well, I know within 2 years, only 10% are still doing the exercise program. If people start a new diet, within 2 years, only 10% are still on that new diet. We just published a paper. Well, actually, it's been accepted. We have the page proofs. It'll show up in PubMed probably in 2 or 3 weeks. It's about our health. We used health behaviors, diet, meditation, exercise in people newly diagnosed with MS. We're able to show that at a year, 95.1% were still doing the steady diet. 90.5% were still doing the walking exercise, and 75% were still doing the daily meditation.
That's awesome.
That is extraordinary. And that's part of the reason that, in my practice, we're so successful is that we help people actually do the diet and lifestyle things. And we admit that this is hard. It is really hard to make new habits. It is really hard for us to reframe our understanding of the world so that we understand that this is vital to my health and vitality. So, yep, I'm going to do it. It is hard. And abandoning the old processed foods that are delicious, plentiful, and that we crave and that we probably have some level of addiction to is really hard. You're going to go through withdrawal, craving, you'll be irritable, you'll be cranky. Moving again is hard. Being sedentary, we're wired to prefer that. It is hard. I admit that. This is really hard. It'll be some of the hardest things that you ever do, which is 100%. Why it is so imperative that we work with people to find out what really is the deepest thing they treasure in their heart. And then we help them craft what are the goals that they have so they could be there more effectively for that person or pet that they treasure in their heart. And then, and it was my veterans who taught me, that's the most important work that I have to do with my patients. I have to help them clarify those 2 points. Once we get that clarified, then they're willing to run barefoot over broken glass to meet those goals. But if you don't clarify that, then they just want pleasure and comfort and you won't move the needle.
100%. I think that's the most valuable thing. One thing I always ask people that come to me almost upon our first conversation is, what would you do if tomorrow you woke up and your health was back? What would you do with your health?
Yeah.
And people haven't really thought about it. And it was something that someone asked me actually about a year and a half ago. And I was still kind of in the heat of stuff. And I was thinking about it. And I was like, that's why I want to do this. So pursuing my NTP, I'll come back for the Wahls.
And that will be marvelous, because those of us who have been through enormous difficulty, enormous disability, we understand the depth of pain and despair that people are coming from. 100%. And then we can more easily relate. We can more easily talk about, okay, we have to do things at a small, slow, step-by-step progress where you can be successful.
Yep. One last sort of thing I want to ask you on this topic before we kind of switch into funding difficulties there and furthering research in these fields is sort of this idea of what I've noticed and through reading I've done, particularly with MS, we see higher rates of these illnesses, or MS specifically, in higher latitudes. And of course, there's correlation with vitamin Ds and things. But I was wondering if you think there's a level of, like, I'm from Wisconsin originally, like in the winter, you do not want to go outside. But I found fundamentally one of the most important things you can do for yourself is embrace seasonality. So get a little bit cold, embrace the sun when it's warm in the summer. And sort of these principles that are honestly like pretty much all free. They're not free of discomfort, but they're all free. But I wondered, like, I know these are things you have thought about as well with that northern latitude increase in certain illness. And I wonder if that's tied to sort of like higher indoor lifestyles, obviously socioeconomic issues. But I'd love to sort of your take on that, because for me, I found that you can sort of combat these by embracing the seasonality of where you're at. There's a big thing right now in the health community of health influencers moving to Costa Rica or Mexico. And I always tell people you don't need to do that if you just embrace the nature of where you are. I mean, you're in Iowa. I lived in the Midwest for a while, so I get it.
We have societies that were tremendously successful in the Arctic. The Yupik had tremendous reproductive success in the Arctic. The Vikings had tremendous reproductive success in Scandinavia and in Iceland. We don't have to move south. We can be very successful all over the globe. But if we have more of an ancestral health point of view, we know that the further north you go, the more likely you are in modern society to have a low vitamin D. And we know that people with low vitamin Ds are more likely to have more aggressive disease states. What is super interesting, Ryan, is supplements. We thought if you just took a vitamin D supplement, that would fix things. In the prospective studies, it hasn't done as well. Maybe if we did vitamin D plus vitamin K2 plus vitamin A plus magnesium, we would have better outcome. And probably we would. But you probably really need to go outside and get a tan.
Yep, 100%.
So I tell people, take vitamin D plus vitamin K, take magnesium, take a multivitamin, and get a tan. Get a deep tan without a sunburn. And then, yes, you're going to fade during the winter. If you can keep your vitamin D in the top half of the reference range, you'll be less likely to get pneumonia and COVID. Or if you get pneumonia and COVID, it'll be more likely to be mild. But you still need the tan, because we know that light, when it hits my skin, in addition to raising the vitamin D level, also speaks to my immune cells in very favorable ways. And we've known for some time that if you have an autoimmune skin disorder, getting a tan is one of the best ways to regress that autoimmune skin disorder, whatever the skin disorder is.
Yeah, it's actually really fascinating. We've dived pretty deep into just melanin on the podcast. We've interviewed Dr. Solis Herrera, who's wrote like a whole book on it. And the 3 different types of melanin, things like pheomelanin, uromelanin, and neuromelanin. And that's some crazy stuff. We'll have to get into that another time, especially with neuromelanin and things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. It's just this huge rabbit hole of possibilities that are super fascinating. But I'd love to sort of shift now in the last 10 minutes of our show to just talking about what you're doing now, because you brought about some really, quote, radical ideas to modern medicine. And I love kind of 2-part question. One is how has it been received over time? And then 2, have you seen bottlenecks in pursuing your research? Because a lot of centralized science seems to be pretty captured by pharmaceutical endorsement. So how have you been able to sort of circumvent that, or strategies you've had with funding your research? So
super interesting. I've been very active on social media. I had my successful TED Talk, and we have an robust email list. And I see patients. And through that, we've had grateful patients help fund our research. So my early pilot studies were funded through philanthropy. Then the MS Society funded the Wahls versus Swank diet study. Then again, a grateful patient funded postdoc scholars. And this grateful family also funded my current trial comparing the keto diet and paleo diet to usual diet. Now, at first, when I was so active on social media, it made the university very nervous. So, they sat me down and said, you be careful. That you're not making claims. So they taught me how to speak carefully. So I was talking about improving physiology, supporting health, and careful not to make claims that I'm treating, cure, or preventing disease. I'm just letting your cells work better, and they do the work. And I keep writing grants to the NIH, and so far we've not been funded. But it is interesting. The criticisms are getting less and less hostile. And actually, I'm very optimistic that we will be getting funding from the NIH soon. And even though I've not been funded by the NIH, we've had robust funding from our grateful patients. So I've been presenting our research every year at the major scientific meetings for multiple sclerosis. We'll have 3 research posters at ACTRIMS again this year, the Americans Committee on the Treatment and Research in MS. We've had, I published 60 peer-reviewed papers and posters. We have presented at the Consortium of MS Centers, which is the premier international meeting of MS clinicians and scientists. We started going to that meeting in 2018, and people, thought I was really pretty radical and maybe a little dangerous when I first started talking about all this stuff in 2008, and I got banned, and terrible things were said about me on the internet, et cetera, et cetera. But I just kept going where I was invited. And now when I go to these international meetings, the MS meetings, the clinicians are stopping me, asking questions, and they're whipping out their phone and saying, Dr. Wahls, could I have my nurse get a picture of you and me? My patients would really like that. Of course, I say, yeah, of course, I'm happy to do that. So we are making progress. Dr. Schnetzler did a really interesting network meta-analysis comparing all of the dietary intervention studies, and there were 12 studies, 8 diets, the Mediterranean, ketogenic, anti-inflammatory, low saturated fat, calorie restriction, fasting, Paleolithic, and usual diet. And so, to see how they impacted fatigue and quality of life. What we saw was for fatigue, it was paleo, Mediterranean, low saturated fat, with paleo being about 50% more effective than either low saturated fat or Mediterranean. And then for quality of life, it was paleo and Mediterranean, with the paleo being twice as effective as the Mediterranean diet. People are recognizing and celebrating our work in the dietary research space for the study of MS. So it's a lot of progress. It takes 30 years to change the standard of care. We're 15 years into it. I'd say the next 5 years, this will get much closer to the standard of care, and certainly within the next 15, this will be the standard of care that when you're diagnosed with MS or an autoimmune disease with neurologic symptoms, you'll be told that, yes, we may have FDA-approved drugs, but just as important is improving your diet. And hopefully they'll be acknowledging that which diets are the most effective, but there are many diets that you could consider.
Totally. And it's super fascinating. Like, I've been just doing a bunch of digging on myself, and it's amazing, even with like going back to just the sun exposure thing for men, like the sun's wavelengths are like 50% red infrared. Your mitochondria straight up suck that in, and
love that.
It's crazy because you just go there and it's free. Even in the winter, you got it. So it's like there's really no excuses to not taking on some of these principles. As we kind of go out of the show, I'd love for you to talk about your current research study you're recruiting for and how people can find that. And I'll have info on that in the show notes as well.
So we have a really exciting study comparing the time-restricted olive oil ketogenic diet to the modified paleo diet, which basically people know as the Wahls paleo, to usual diet. People come to Iowa City at month 0, month 3, month 24, at month, and you get your walking assessment, hand assessment, vision assessment, and some surveys at every point. And you also get an MRI without contrast at month 0 and month 24. And everyone comes in, you get your baseline assessment, and then you get randomized into one of 3 diets. The reason we randomize is that lets us have the strongest evidence that diet has some impact. All 3 groups are vital to our success. The 2 intervention groups will meet with the dietitian, will get trained on their diet. The intervention group will not meet with the dietitian, but the control group won't meet with the dietitian. But the control group will get a monthly tip sheet from me on things that they can do to improve their diet. And I anticipate that all 3 groups, in fact, will have some improvements. One of the interesting questions that we have is what happens to brain volume? Because we know people with MS, and that includes me, by the way, as a group, our brains are shrinking 1% per year. So that's why we have higher rates of anxiety, depression, more frailty, more nursing home care. In my clinical practice, I see anxiety and depression go away. We see mental clarity greatly improve. So I'm very hopeful that, in fact, we will see brain volume loss get back to healthy rates of aging. That's less than 0.3% per year. And I expect that all 3 groups will improve because people who go in diet studies want to improve their diet. So I think my control group, when I give them the monthly tip sheet to improve their diet, they're going to improve their diet, most likely.
That's super exciting.
Yeah. So the website that we have that tells people more about the diet is terrywahls.com/MS study. And there's a little yellow bar that I want you to click to complete the survey to see if you're eligible. And we're looking for people with relapsing remitting MS. But even if you don't have that, I want you to screen so you can be part of our patient database, because we periodically do survey-based studies. So you wouldn't have to travel. You could be in one of those survey-only based studies.
That is so awesome. And I appreciate really all the work that you've done. And I'll have all that information that you just said in the show notes. Beth got me all of it. So it'll be easy to access. Look in the description, go fill out those forms and be part of this great work that's happening, because I think it's really important. One thing, last thing I was going to say is on that rate of aging stuff, I think about a lot heteroplasmy rates increasing, not just normally every decade after something like 6 or something like that. And I really think about every summer when we go out in the summer sun, just hanging out in nature, that's naturally our heteroplasmy rate will go up. And then if we really embrace the seasonality of winter, especially if you're in northern latitude, you have access, that's how we can shrink down our heteroplasmy a little bit. And so it's really about, you got to be a little uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. And it's truly about embracing all these things that we talked about on the podcast. And amazing things happen. I always tell people your story first, because you're one of the great examples of, you come back from not being able to sit up to riding bikes to hiking,
and I can now jog 20 minutes on my treadmill.
Yeah. It's it's things that you would be told were not possible, could never happen.
And I completely accepted that. That was just, and I'd done everything that I described that I was going to do just to keep using my hands, because I could still feed myself, still wipe my own butt. And that's really, really valuable stuff you don't want to lose. So when I'm getting better at, I can walk around, I can sit up, I can eat at the table again. I had let go of the future. So I didn't know what any of that meant. It wasn't until the day I rode my bike that I allowed myself to think, how much recovery might be possible? That was the day the future came back to me. And, I can jog 20 minutes, not fast, but I can jog. And now I'm like, I don't know how much further I can get. Will I be able to someday do a triathlon? I don't know. Maybe. Who knows?
If you do, let me know. I'll train and we'll do it together. That's the goal.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll start with the sprint triathlons that are much shorter in duration.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again, Dr. Wahls, for coming on. I'll have all your links to your socials, your website in the description as well. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this episode of Decentralized Radio. We'll see you in the next one.